Hello and welcome to this podcast. And this podcast is going to be specialising on a particular area of business that I know is of great interest to a lot of our listeners and viewers, which is the area of sales effectiveness, also sometimes known as commercial effectiveness. And I've got a very special guest joining me today, Greg Walsh, who has been a friend of mine for quite some time, as well as being a colleague in business. Greg has an excellent background in this subject area, having once been Vice President of Baxter, also with BD or Becton Dickinson and BTG, amongst a number of other areas of business. His background prior to those senior positions takes him all the way back to being a sales rep in Ireland in the pharmaceutical industry, as well as the medical device industry. So Greg, great to have you here today. Thank you for joining me to talk about this really interesting area, which I know both you and I are really excited and interested in. So perhaps a really good place to start, if you could, would be just to give us an idea of what is sales effectiveness, sometimes called commercial excellence. What would you say is the definition of it from your perspective?
Thanks for the introduction, Nigel. Really appreciate it. This is an area that's very close to my heart. I started out years ago as a sales rep in Ireland, and I eventually worked my way up to running Europe, Middle East and Africa across the whole board as a sort of general manager. Commercial excellence is really about bringing the customer what they really want. It's not about hoodwinking a customer or transactional sales. It's about bringing something to a customer where you build a lasting long-term relationship. And there's a whole science behind it, there's a whole art behind it, there's a whole organisation behind delivering it, way more than just the sales organisation. So you have to get the sales organisation right, and you have to delight the customer, but you also need a whole organisation to deliver the offering, whether it's a product or a service.
And you talked when we were having a discussion, in fact, we were originally having a discussion about this a few weeks ago over a very nice lunch, I remember, and we talked about the integration of all of this within marketing. And one of the things I thought was really fascinating, and probably fascinating for a number of our listeners or viewers who are in marketing, was the importance of getting that alignment right. And your opinion was that this really had to be, had to almost be driven, or at least very much in partnership with marketing. Can you elaborate on that a bit for us?
I can, Nigel. And when I was a sales rep running a business or an area, I thought I ran the world and everything I did was about me. When I became a sales manager and I started, managing a $50 million business, and I had a team of salespeople and clinical people and customer service, I thought it was about our team was really creating all of the value that interacted with the customer. And when you're in that role, you do really believe that. And sometimes you get frustrated with the rest of the organization, and the rest of the organization actually gets frustrated with you as well. So there's always a little bit of tension between sales and the organization. As I've moved through different levels within business and up to corporate strategy and looking at where you make your investments geographically or from an R&D point of view and all the other elements, you start to realize actually the organization needs to be fully integrated and aligned and engaged with the customer to understand their particular needs. I was doing some consultancy work recently for a really, really smart medical team who had developed a new drug they were launching it in the US market, and they asked me to get involved on the commercialization side in the US market. But once I started looking at it, the problem was they had developed the drug in isolation and they hadn't actually looked at the drug from a commercial point of view, looking at the reimbursement within the market, looking at the needs of the customer, looking at the competition and all the other elements within that. And they'd actually developed a drug that was going to be incredibly difficult to commercialize because there was very little to differentiate the product from other people. But technically it was a great drug, but it still wasn't aligned within the particular market. So when I start looking at an organization, I believe it has to be customer focused, market led, and marketing really needs to be one of the core functions of the organization that interacts with the customer. And sales is an arm of marketing. I know people hate that, and when I was in sales, I hated hearing that. But it really is. As part of the promotional mix, you can decide whether you're going to do advertising, digital sales, whether you're going to have real sales as in a sales team, what it's going to look like, and so on. So the sales team plays a part in all of this. Now, if we just step back just for a moment and think about something really, really simple, and I know some of the areas we're looking at are quite complex, but just think about this. If sales is equivalent to, for example, the waiter in a restaurant who is interacting with the customer, is bringing out the menu, is serving them at the table, is bringing the product out or the food out to the table in a timely manner, and all the other elements. If you actually step back from that and think about what the waiter is actually working with, somebody's actually put a business plan together to decide they're going to set up a restaurant. Somebody has decided what market they're going to go after, in what location, at what price point, with what product, what's the product mix, what's actually going to be on the menu, at what prices is it going to be actually at, what type of chef are you going to have, is it going to be gourmet chef, is it going to be basic chef, what type of food are you actually serving, and in what location, or what's the market you want to go into. So even before the waiter or the sales actually get anywhere near the product, the whole environment, the business plan, the infrastructure, the capital investment, the R&D into what's required, all of that is put in place so that the sales team actually has something to sell. So the important thing as well is the example I just gave a few minutes ago about the R&D team or the medical team working in isolation. They need the input from in this case, it would be the people in the restaurant, the customers, and the feedback they're giving, so that the R&D people can actually change the menu, advance the product, and actually meet what's actually required. So you need the interface, the feedback going both ways within an organization. So it's not one part of the organization or the other. If the chef isn't cooking well, if the food isn't fresh, if the logistics isn't set up right, if the cash collection isn't there, if the cash flow isn't right, so the whole organization needs to be put together in a way that you actually delight that particular customer. And the hardest thing in sales is creating, because it's a service in a sense. I know you may be selling a product or you might sell a service. Any service from a customer point of view has to be consistent, whether that's McDonald's consistency or whether that's a 5-star Michelin restaurant consistency. The customer is expecting the same level of service. So one of the challenges when we get into commercialization and sales effectiveness is the customer, if you have sales interacting with the customer in a very erratic manner and a non-consistent manner, where the sales team may have favourite customers for not the right reasons, or favourite customers they like visiting, versus ones they don't like go visiting, which are actually sometimes the highest value accounts or the highest potential. They just also happen to be some of the more difficult accounts to get into. But you're visiting them in a more irregular manner and not giving them on a more consistent manner. The customer doesn't know what to actually expect. So you, when you're managing the overall sales side of it, you really have to think about that customer experience and what they're expecting from your company.
And that's what it was one of the phrases you used when we were speaking last time, which I really liked, was about accelerating your sales through delighting your customers. And I think that's a really interesting perspective in a way. And of course, that's what most people would like to do, isn't it? To delight your customer so that you get yourself into a position where the customer they'll never always feel positive about you, but you try and make them feel as positive as possible. And you touched on something there when you were just talking about this, which I think is a really interesting aspect of this, because there is this feeling that sometimes some salespeople they kind of do a lot of this stuff, this kind of stratification or segmentation. They kind of do it almost naturally, don't they? But then a lot of salespeople, and I'm sure all of us that have done the job have probably been guilty of this at times, you can probably end up spending too much time with the customers that you like, and you like them because they like you, and you're probably almost over servicing those, aren't you? And I guess Is that the first stage really of understanding of sales effectiveness, is actually looking at that stratification? I mean, if you had to, well, here's a question then, actually thinking about that. If you had to design a sales effectiveness strategy for a company that had never really thought about this before, what would be the kind of low hanging areas that you would focus on first? What would be those key things to make them understand that this is worth having you in there to sort it out for them?
There was a lot there, Nigel. Just stepping back just for what your first comment was, always delighting the customer. You don't always delight a customer, because in the real world, things go wrong. There's product shipments, there's delays, there's quality issues with products. With all the best will in the world, you may be targeting zero defects, you may be targeting zero issues with operations and everything else. You will always run across a challenge. Okay, the customer knows that as well. They live in the real world. But the thing that you have to be doing as an organization is you have to own the issue and not dump it back on the customer. So there is a way to interact with customers in a very forthright, factual way, and actually they really appreciate it if you manage the elements within your control. But the best practice I've ever experienced was when I was working in Canada, and my boss was a lady at the time, and she was just exceptional. We got actually the number one supplier in Canada for medical devices and pharmaceutical in the whole country. And I was running one of the business divisions, but she was the president of the country, of our business. And she taught me so much on how to hold ourselves accountable for what's going on in the customer experience, as well as holding the customer accountable for what they should be doing as well. And that makes a very grown-up relationship, because if you are subservient all the time, sometimes you can never win and you can never satisfy the customer expectations. But actually, if you're both on a grown-up relationship, I know this sounds very simple, but where you have a very good relationship, where you're both working towards a purpose, an outcome, you're trying to achieve something to support the customer achieve what they're trying to achieve, and you're both responsible to do certain things, the customer still is delighted, because they know that they're working with somebody who's working to achieve what's the best possible. They're not just in a transaction to leave you with a product and with a problem. So I think that's just coming back to always delighting. You always strive to delight, but part of that is also a very mature grown-up relationship. Yes. Coming back to the sales effectiveness, it's multifactorial in when you approach something. So I was working in a business that I took over, and it was quite a big business across Europe. And the first thing I did was a review of all of the segments across all of Europe in all of the different countries. And very quickly realized that there was some very, very low hanging fruit because of our culture as an organization and how we managed the actual sales territories and how we covered key accounts and how we engaged with customers, and also how the culture we had created for our sales reps and the incentives we had created for our sales reps. Because what we were doing was we were allowing a sales rep to hit their number regardless of what product mix they were actually selling and where the priorities were for the company. So a sales rep was always a good sales rep if they could hit their number. And we always want people to be hitting numbers. But actually, from a company perspective, there's a deeper strategy, which is to do with profitability. It's also to do with customer ownership. It's to do with a whole pile of other dimensions. And you may want the sales rep to behave in a different way or focus in a different way and so on. So you have to make sure that your account plans are aligned with the customer, that your incentive schemes are aligned with the customer, and all those other elements. So I think that's, there's always low-hanging fruit when you come into a business. With regards to sales reps, none of us are masochists. I don't think there's many masochists in the sales world. We want to go where we can achieve sales. So we go where the easiest sale actually is, the one with the least amount of confrontation, the least amount of competitive activity. But actually, if you look at the really good reps, they're really smart in how they pick off the high value customers and how they work those particular customers and get some of the value coming in. So you do have to make sure that you're segmenting your customers properly. You're actually focusing on key accounts, that you're making sure that your reps are calling on your key accounts at a regular interval, coming back to what I said earlier about consistency of service and expectations from the customer point of view. And they're focused on where the value is and not just where the easiest avenue is through the whole lot of it. I mean, you kind of need a blend of both, but you do need a discipline and an overview to make sure that that's happening on a consistent basis. Especially when you're looking at a country like the UK, where you'll have multiple reps on the road, or when you're looking across Europe, where you're going to have thousands of reps across Europe. How are you making sure that they're focusing in on the right customers with the right message, with the right, giving the right service and the right frequency and all these other elements that people are actually expecting?
And how much does, in your experience, how much does incentive come into that?
Incentive is very important. I mean, the type of person that works in sales does have to be an incentive-driven individual. So you always have to make sure that you have your base and your incentive well focused, but making sure that the incentive is not just on sales numbers, but is also on what the rep is doing. It's the how the rep is interacting with the customer, not necessarily just the results, but it's the how is crucially important as well. Years ago, I came onto a territory. I was a new rep into a new company, and the sales manager was the former rep for the territory I had just taken over. And I arrived onto the territory, and I was fresh to sales and the whole lot of it. And the sales manager had just been promoted because they had achieved all of their numbers, and they had won all of the business that they needed to win to become rep of the year, and then became sales manager. The problem was that when I went on to territory, I couldn't get into any hospitals. I couldn't get into any of the primary care centres because my sales manager had upset them so much with the way the person was actually selling, the way they were selling. They had alienated every single customer. And the way they had achieved their sales was they had found one avenue in through wholesale pharmacy at this particular time. And they got all of their growth and all of their sales in this one little, it was just one channel. So on one side, the person was quite ingenious in that they actually achieved all of their sales. On the other side, they had destroyed the business for the next 3 to 4 years because no customer would let you in the door other than the wholesale channel. So a big part of this is when you're in business, you want to be having a sustainable relationship with the customer. And when I look at it, I come from a background where 95% market share with loads of competition trying to get into the market is something that we actually strive for because we delight the customer in such a way that you can actually engage with them on their journey, on their outcomes, on what they're actually trying to achieve, and they just want to work with you. So trying to do that in a market that actually has a lot of competition is quite an interesting world to live in. So that's the kind of background that I actually come from.
And if people are listening or watching this and they're thinking to themselves, okay, sales effectiveness is something that we ought to be attending to. What would you say to them in terms of where they would start? So it goes back to one of my earlier questions. What would they do first if they thought, well, we've got a reasonable size sales team, we've got sales managers in place, we try and do the right thing. What would be those kind of first elements that they ought to think about in terms of getting a really effective sales effectiveness or commercial excellence program in place?
It's a really good question, Nigel. There's a whole process. I mean, this is not just ad hoc, feeling type of business or area. There's a whole systematic process of all the areas that you really need to decide. You either have to be, industry fit, as in doing it well enough, or best in class. And there's areas across, when we look at the strategy and culture, the customer management, the talent management, sales operations, all of those areas have multiple areas that you have to be considering as part of your sales effectiveness. Now, the problem is there's probably about 24, 28 different areas that you have to focus on. And within all of those areas, there's multiple different levels. So you have to be good in a lot of the areas. But the problem is there's too much to focus in on. So what you have to really do is you have to understand, do sort of a quick overview and analysis of where the opportunity actually is and where your organization is and where the opportunity will come from. And that could be from the culture, it could be from key account management, it could be from customer segmentation. There's a lot of different elements in it. But when I start normally, the first thing I do is I actually start looking at what's going on today, how we're currently covering the customers, what is the performance for the different reps, what are the areas, how are they achieving their actual particular goals, and also interacting with the customer to start getting feedback on how they see the customer or how they see our company as well. So you can start at multiple different levels, but you kind of have to run on parallel tracks. You really do have to put a team together to be constantly working at improving the areas that you need to improve. And as I said, it's from every aspect of it. Do you want to be selling like an insurance salesperson, or do you want to be selling like a Medtronic when they're selling cardiac, when they're selling into the cardiac space, which is a high value, high ad, outcomes focused transaction? Or do you want an insurance sales where they're just transactional and just need your life assurance today or your whatever today? So it's all very, very transactional and they don't need repeat business coming back. So what is it? What type of sales are you actually trying to do? What's the customer expectation? But the one thing we do have to understand is that if we keep just doing what we're doing at the moment, we have competition who are innovating. We have customers who are evolving and starting to change their expectations. And a lot of customers now are starting to look at the outcomes of what's actually they're trying to achieve. So they're not really worried about how many products they have coming in to achieve something. They want somebody to work with them to actually start achieving outcomes and better outcomes. That could be better patient outcomes, it could be better operational outcomes, it could be better something. They're trying to achieve something, and that's why they're buying a widget or a service. And we have to get more involved in that whole value chain as you actually get into it.
Yeah, this has obviously become a much bigger thing, hasn't it, over the last few years in healthcare, is looking at the healthcare outcomes and how you evaluate what an outcome is, of course. For those people who may have inherited a sales team that is selling in the more traditional way, what way do you move those people on from, as you know, my background was selling those high value medical devices. It was very much, it was very sophisticated in terms of the selling of the technical aspects, but from a sales perspective actually probably wasn't that sophisticated because it was a features and benefits thing. It was, this is our algorithm, it's better than than the competition or whatever. So, buy our device rather than theirs, and when have you got the next implant? So it was a kind of, much more of that kind of features and benefits type of sell. And now, even for those types of products, they're moving more and more towards those outcomes thing. How do you shift, the mindset perhaps of the more traditional technical salesperson, we'll call them. And by the way, I'm not knocking those people because they do a fantastic job. But how do you shift them into a more of a outcomes solution orientated type of sales delivery, shall we say?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. A lot of the time when you're moving towards outcomes and creating value, you have to be working with customers who want to engage with you in that manner. Not all customers do. Some customers are very transactional and very price sensitive and very widget orientated. So again, you have to segment customers to understand the ones that will engage on greater outcomes. And these are the ones that you've built a more trusting relationship with and will actually evolve forward on that. From a sales point of view, a lot of the time when you're getting into outcomes, this is where I come back to, it's the rest of the organization you have to be able to work with. So the nature of the salesperson sometimes has to evolve more into an account manager, where they're coordinating the interaction with the customer and putting together the resources. If I think about the pharma and the medical device, so what are the clinical resources, the technical resources, the medical resources, what sort of services does the customer need, whether it's home care or what type of just-in-time or whether it's consignment stocking. What are they looking at, from a customer point of view? So you really need marketing to be pulling that whole offering together, and then working sales as part of that, where they together between the segmentation of the customer and the actual offering that's going to be put together, and also then determining what the outcome is going to be. Like, what is it you're actually trying to achieve? Because sometimes you shift that with the customer and work with the customer on doing that. So it takes more of a coordination role across the organization. That's what the sales start becoming. And some people make that journey and some people don't. Some people will remain very, very good at widget selling and selling lots of individual widgets, and that's where they're really, really comfortable. And some people just don't make that transition. Other people start to see it and say, right, I get it. I understand now that actually the customer just doesn't want to buy, my 2 or 3 products. They're looking at what outcomes those particular products actually achieve. And they will start changing as they start to get some traction. And the way I normally start it is, I would normally start something with what I call points of light, where you start putting pilots in place to show best practice of what's actually possible. So it's very difficult to change an organization overnight that's currently selling widgets on a transactional basis into a more sophisticated selling. But the way to do that is for the organization to learn and for the customer to learn on how to advance that particular sales. And you would start with a number of pilot projects with some key customers, and then they would become some of your key accounts where you're putting the best resources out of your company to move into that. And this is where a lot of companies get very frustrated. If you're in a leadership position and you've developed all of the R&D, or you've been the first to market, or you're technologically advanced in whatever field it actually is, people get frustrated and they say, oh, we're the best, or we're the first, or we're the whatever. Well, what does that actually mean to the customers? A question that I always ask. And actually what that means is you understand that product or that service inside out better than anybody else. You've put all the research and development, you've got all the best people in the world, all the best engineers, the best medics, the best scientists, the best whatever, to develop that particular product. And all of that knowledge is worth something. It's more than just the actual widget itself. It's how to get the best out of whatever you're trying to do. And the customer appreciates being able to access that knowledge, because they sometimes struggle with how to engage with what you're doing, or how to get the best outcome, or how to get a competitive advantage relative to somebody else. So you being able to work with them for them to continue to advance their position is hugely important. Or in the pharma space and the medical device space, the hospital space, how do they reduce some of the pressures on the healthcare system? So working with them on innovative solutions is really key. But you have to understand that we have way more value to offer than just a good widget. There's a lot more. And I think there's some companies that really, really do get that, and they excel in how to do that. And the customers love engaging with them. And that makes it really difficult for the transactional salesperson to walk in the door and say, look, I've just got a nice widget. Because the customer's engaged with another company on so many different levels, more than just the widget itself.
Yeah. There's a lot of companies now moving more and more into the kind of data side of things, and looking at how, again, on the healthcare side, looking at how they can assist hospitals in terms of looking at, maybe treatment times, the amount of time the patient's in hospital and so on. So there's a number of different ways in which they can utilize the data that they may be getting from a device, or maybe, part of a treatment of a drug perhaps, that can then be utilized by the customer to actually make their practice better. And I think that's the kind of, that's sometimes more difficult, isn't it, to sell for particularly the person that's been that kind of more features and benefits type of approach.
Yeah, it's to be honest, that's a huge journey. That's not something that happens overnight. That's where when you start to feed into say, look, the organization, we want to shift towards this because we know we have to. And then your recruitment policy starts recruiting in people that have the capability to actually operate in an environment like that. So not everybody can do it. So this would be sort of a 5-year plan to move towards outcomes focused. When I get into the more fundamental sales efficiency, looking at, are we covering the right customers? Do we have the right incentives lined up? Do we have the right people in place? Do they have the right culture? Is the how working well? Have we got a good relationship with the customer? This is all stuff that's a lot easier to sort out. So one business I took over, we had our sales growth in our key focus areas, which is the areas the company wanted to focus on, and we believed helped us from a competitive position, helped the customer, helped everything, helped bottom line, all these other elements, was growing at about 6%. And going in and doing the basic block and tackle within that organization, I'm talking about like just right people, right place, right resources, right customers, right messaging, get a bit of alignment on marketing, within marketing and so on, and right incentive focus and so on. We actually accelerated growth up to 27% within 9 months. And that was within that particular area. And that's nothing fancy. That's just your basic blocking and tackling, as I would call it. But it's not even basic. You still have to do that incredibly well. And there's a lot of process and commercial knowledge that has to go into how to do that on a more systematic basis, rather than relying on whether my rep is good or bad. You want all reps to be, good, and then you'll have your exceptional rep. You just don't want to have, the reps all over the place on performance. And there's part of that is to do with the way management manage the reps, and the way that the processes are put in place supports all reps to perform to a higher standard. But you can get very quick results just focusing on those. Those shifting to outcomes is a journey. I mean, it really is. It's a cultural journey with the customer. It's a cultural journey with internally, and figuring out how to get an organization that's normally siloed with some ropey bridges between each of the silos into something that's got more of a symbiotic relationship across all of the functions, that they actually create a synergy which is greater than the individual parts. It's greater than the thing, and you can harness all of that to engage with the customer. That is a journey. That's probably a 5-year journey to get somebody to move to that level.
Mm. But that's probably a great place for us to wrap up, because we've almost got to the end of our time, Greg. So thank you so much. It's a huge area of discussion, of course, and but I think you've covered a bit what is a big topic in a fantastic way, and also, I mean, I love that statistic there at the end of where you can change something, in terms of growth by attending to some of the more straightforward areas, and you can achieve significant growth from that. And I think that's one of the real messages from this in terms of looking at sales effectiveness is obviously why is one doing it? You do it in order, as you say, to create that alignment, create the process, so that you can then end up with genuine improvements to your overall business and also your revenues, and then the kind of longer term strategies of looking at outcomes, which of course, if any listener or viewer is not from healthcare, we've been talking a lot about healthcare, but the same applies with those as well. Is that if you're looking at outcomes as far as your sales, then you've probably got a longer journey, and you've got quite a lot more to actually look at. But I think the fascinating thing about this is that sales leadership is a real professional area with a lot of moving parts to it, and really fascinating. As I say, we could talk about this for a lot longer than we've got time allowed. But Greg, thank you so much. Been really good input. At the end of this, there will be a little bit of an outro, and you'll be able to see where to pick up Greg's LinkedIn profile. and see some of the other interesting things that he's involved in. But thanks again, Greg, and look forward to maybe having another one of these discussions on another area with you at some point in the future.
Thank you, Nigel. Take care.
Thank you for listening or watching this podcast. More podcasts in this series can be found on the Remtech Talent website and also most podcast platforms under The Job Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast and have a great day.